Welcome back to the Bible in Context. I am glad to be back here with Caleb this time, and it is good to continue on our journey. And so today we're actually going to do a recap of where we have been in Genesis up to this point, just to kind of bring the whole story together before we jump into chapter 18 next time. And so with that, Caleb, you want to say anything before we get started?
Well, glad you're back, but other than that, no. Let's dive into the recap. This is your week to lead us through where we've been so far in Genesis.
Yeah. So I'm excited to be here. All right. So we started off in Genesis chapter 1, and we looked at the creation story, and we argued that the author's intent was not to explain the how of creation, but the why of creation. That Genesis is not a science textbook that is meant to inform us of all the mechanics of the early universe. No, Genesis 1 instead gives us a picture of the function of the universe. The literary structure and the pattern of Genesis 1 are significant in this. And we see that the first 3 days of creation, God forms the cosmos. And then in day 4, 5, and 6, God fills the cosmos. And so we talked about how the ancient world had a much different understanding of cosmic geography. In the ancient world, they believed that the earth or the land was actually a floating island surrounded by water on all sides, and the rakia, or the firmament, was kind of like a glass dome, a force field that separated the waters above from the waters below. And so they kind of pictured us living on an island in a snow globe. And so Genesis 1 describes the creation of this snow globe, this cosmos. And again, God is using what they understand, or what they understood the world to be like, and he was using their language to explain why he created the universe. And so he created the snow globe cosmos, as they understood it, to be filled with life that would multiply and grow and spread his creative glory all over the world. And so at the center of God's good creation, we see in Genesis 1 are humans, made in the image of God to rule on his behalf. So humans were created to spread God's loving and good order through the rest of the earth. We talked about how humans being God's image bearers isn't so much about us taking on the character traits of God as much as it is a status. Being God's image bearers, it's a status. It means that we have this status of being his royal representatives, his viceroys, his ambassadors. After God finished his good creation, he rested on the seventh day, which we talked about was not God taking a nap or a vacation after a long week of work. He rested into his heavenly throne room to rule and reign his good creation. And then in chapter 2 of Genesis, we get a description then of the Garden of Eden, which is his temple. It's his throne room. And so God rested his image bearers, Adam, in the garden, and then he brought all the animals before Adam to name them, but there was not an animal that fit as a partner with Adam. And so God created Eve as another image bearer to rule alongside of Adam. And now in the center of the garden, God plants these two trees. Talked a lot about these two trees. The first was the tree of life, and the second was the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And those who ate from the tree of life would enjoy eternal life with God. But God warned Adam and Eve that if they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, that they would surely die. And so at this point in the story, we're introduced to another character that was in the garden that could talk. It's a serpent who is very clearly not simply a snake. He's a spiritual being who is an adversary of Yahweh. Later on, we would come to know him as Satan. And the serpent deceives Adam and Eve into eating the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And immediately Adam and Eve's eyes were open. They feel naked and ashamed. They try to hide from God, and God seeks them out and shows his gracious character in that moment. He doesn't immediately kill them for the rebellion, but he does pronounce the consequences of their decisions. But even in the midst of God handing out curses and consequences for their actions, he gives hope. And so we come to Genesis 3:15, and it's one of the most important verses in all of the Bible. Let me read it. So God is talking to the serpent here, and he says, I'll put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He will bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. And so throughout the rest of Genesis and the Bible, you can find the seed of the serpent acting like the serpent, deceptive, against God's will, trying to be God himself. And you can also follow the chosen seed of the woman all the way to Jesus, the serpent crusher. In the very next chapter in Genesis, after Adam and Eve have been exiled out of the garden, they have two children, Cain and Abel. And Cain acts like the serpent, murders his brother Abel. And now, in this story, we spent almost an entire episode on Genesis chapter 4, verse 7, arguing for a retranslation. And so if you haven't listened to that episode, I'd encourage you to go back and check it out. I don't have time to rehash all those arguments right now. But I think the translation that we argue for helps to better make sense of the tension in that narrative and shows you a lot of God's character in the midst of what's going on there. Now, after the story of Cain and Abel, we looked at the first genealogies in Genesis and talked about their significance. And in these genealogies, you can continue to follow the two seeds, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. And the seed of the woman leads us all the way from Adam to Noah. And while the seed of the serpent leads us to the Nephilim, really, the product of the sons of God taking the daughters of men as their wives. And so in Genesis 6, it describes a world that has been completely demonized and corrupt. And again, we see a divine rebellion leads to a human rebellion. Just like we saw in the garden, there was a divine rebellion that led to a human rebellion. And humanity, at this point in Genesis 6, is heading towards self-destruction. But God in his mercy, he saves one family to repopulate the earth after the flood. And so the flood is described as God's judgment and a collapse of the cosmos. The waters above and the waters below once again cover the land. There's a decreation that goes on here. And God saves Noah and his family and animals by having Noah build an ark, which was very much like a floating temple. And you see Noah being made into this new Adam, this new human representative. He's given the same commission as Adam and Eve to be fruitful and to multiply and to subdue the earth. And unfortunately, like Adam, he sins, he rebels. On a mountain in a vineyard, he eats the fruit, he becomes naked and ashamed. And so this pattern of human failure continues all the way to the Tower of Babel. And so in the Tower of Babel, this is a significant story, not just for God dividing humanity, but also God dividing his divine counsel to help govern fallen humanity. And so we spent an episode talking about Deuteronomy 32 and the divine counsel's rebellion after the Tower of Babel. Humans began worshiping these divine beings, and evidently the divine beings welcomed their worship. And so again, a spiritual rebellion had led to more human rebellion. But the good news is that through all of this, God doesn't give up on humanity. He again chooses one family, specifically Abram's family, to become, in a sense, a new Adam and bring the blessing and the presence of God back to all of humanity. And so he rescues Abram out of Babylon and brings him to the promised land. And God promises that he will become a great nation and that in him all the families of the earth would be blessed. But almost immediately, Abraham, his faith is tested. There's a drought in the land, and so he flees out of the promised land into Egypt, where he lies about his wife, and yet God is gracious to them, and they exit Egypt with great wealth, which there's a lot of themes that we talk about that connect Genesis to the Exodus. And after I get finished with this recap, I'll let Caleb talk a little bit more specifically about that motif throughout Genesis that we see that points us to the Exodus and ultimately to the greatest Exodus that Jesus leads us out of slavery of sin. All right, so back to Genesis. We're with Abraham at this point, and after he exits Egypt with great wealth, Abraham's nephew Lot realizes they come to a point where they can't live in close proximity to each other because there's not enough resources. And so, unfortunately, Lot makes a poor choice, and he moves out of the promised land near the wicked people of Sodom. And he gets swept up into this war between 9 evil nations. And Abraham goes and he rescues his nephew, and then afterwards he encounters this mysterious character, Melchizedek. He was a priest of the God Most High. He's a king of Salem, which is later we find out Jerusalem. And so this royal priestly figure blesses Abraham, and Abraham gives him a tithe. And so we spent almost an entire episode talking about Melchizedek, and Caleb is convinced that Melchizedek is the angel of the Lord, the pre-incarnate Christ.
I'm still hovering on that 95%.
95%.
Just by the way.
He's leaning that way. Almost convinced, I should say. And I will say the idea is definitely growing on me. And regardless of where you fall on that, I think it's obvious that the author of Hebrews in the New Testament looks at Melchizedek as one of the clearest pictures of Christ in the Old Testament. And so he's worth looking at for sure. So after Abraham encounters Melchizedek, the king of Sodom actually tries to manipulate Abraham into owing his allegiance to him. And Abraham refuses to be manipulated, and his faithfulness to Yahweh is highlighted there, which brings us to really the heart of Abraham's story, God's covenant with Abraham. And so God actually ratifies his covenant with Abraham through a covenant ceremony in chapter 15. And then in chapter 16, Sarah tries to take things into her own hands, and she gives her maidservant Hagar to Abraham to have a child. And this, of course, just causes all sorts of conflict and suffering. It's a bad idea. But it also highlights God's compassion. God has compassion on Hagar, and he remains faithful to his promises with Abraham. And he reaffirms his covenant with Abraham, and he gives him the sign of the covenant, circumcision.
Yeah, and I don't know, so you weren't here when we talked about this. By the way, when you have like a long spiel and you're doing most of the talking and we're not conversating, you have a very calming radio voice. I'm all over the place.
I'll probably put people to sleep.
No, it's good. I like this summary to help kind of, at this point, wrap things together and show us where we're at in Genesis and kind of get a feel for the narrative in one sitting. But I want to bring up, since we didn't talk about this, and you probably have read this already, but there's a guy named John Meade. He wrote an article in the Southern Baptist Theological Journal.
Yeah.
And his whole premise in this article is that the sign of circumcision came up from Egypt, where circumcision was used as a sign for people who were priests and are devoted to a god. And so, this is a precursor to making a nation of priests in Abraham.
Oh, interesting. I hadn't heard that. And I can't remember. Did you talked about circumcision on the podcast, I believe?
Yeah, that was last week.
Yeah, so I haven't even had a chance to listen to that one yet. And so maybe you've already talked about just that, like, circumcision was kind of norm for that day and age, and it was often a rite of passage. Right,
yeah. And I think we focus on, I talked about this a bit, how we focus on, well, that was probably painful. Why would God want humans to do that? It's just this bloody, brutal, like, why would he do that? But they don't think about pain probably the same way we do with these rites of passage. And this is meaningful. So
yeah, it was the pain was worth it because the significance of the moment.
Right, and they're probably not as focused on, like, I'm sure it's in the back of their minds, like, this is going to hurt, but it's the rite is so important, like you said, it kind of fades away.
Right.
It's kind of like getting your ears pierced. It probably hurts. I don't know. I don't have my ears pierced.
Yeah.
How many people, whenever they go to get their ears pierced, are really focused on the pain?
Right. Or maybe like a tattoo. That might be that's probably another illustration, which I don't have a tattoo, but
we should go get tattoos. We should get the emblem.
Let's go. Our wives would love it.
Oh yeah. I do like Carmenine's little priestly tattoo on her wrist. Have you seen that?
No, I hadn't seen that.
She has in Hebrew Yahweh, the belonging to the Lord, the priestly emblem.
Oh, really? Really?
She had a whole video where she explained that and got some pushback from some of her.
Oh yeah,
followers.
I'm sure.
It was good.
Yeah. All right. So I wanted you, before we end this recap, I wanted you to just have an opportunity to kind of rehash one of the themes that we've had over several weeks, and I didn't even know how to quite incorporate it into the recap. Is just this overall theme, which you've got a book coming out on this theme that I don't even know if we've even mentioned that on the podcast. So maybe this is a good time to kind of plug that book.
Yeah.
And so maybe you can talk about that book a little bit and why this theme has been kind of incorporated throughout the podcast from the very beginning.
Yeah. I wrote a book. It's called Through the Waters, A Biblical Theology of the Book of Genesis. It's coming out with Whiff & Stocks, Resource Publications, imprint. It's in the late stages of development, so it's almost done, but I don't have a date for when it's going to be out. I'm still waiting. I should be in the next couple of weeks getting a book cover, so I'm waiting for that. Really, having written this was the whole reason that we started this podcast, because we had a whole resource on Genesis. You were also doing the Genesis sermon series, so we had just a lot of thoughts about this book, and I think that the motifs we're highlighting are a fresh perspective that really haven't been highlighted in scholarship, which, again, was the whole impetus for the book. So I don't have any notes like you do, so we'll see, but I wrote a book on it, so hopefully I should be able to talk about it for a few minutes. So the Exodus motif throughout the book of Genesis. And there's the two goats motif as well, but I guess, should I talk about that or leave that aside?
Have we talked about that in the podcast much? I'm trying to think if we've hit on that. We've talked about it a few times, yeah.
We got Cain and Abel, we have
that's right.
Ham and Shem, and Abraham and Lot so far.
Yeah, I would talk about both.
Okay, cool. And by the way, that's kind of the scope of the book, is the Exodus motif and the two goats motif, and they run so thoroughly throughout the book of Genesis that it became an entire biblical theology of Genesis, which, if you don't know what a biblical theology is, there's a few definitions, but it's essentially taking the biblical narrative and seeing how the themes develop throughout the story instead of trying to systematically pick different topics to examine throughout the text. So basically, I'm trying to give us a feel for, in light of these themes, what is the narrative of Genesis trying to teach us and tell us? Well, for now, let's just go ahead and do a recap up to chapter 17, and then we'll continue on from there. So, in light of the Exodus and two goats motif, first we have, you mentioned creation is an exodus from the ruined chaos waters. Adam and Eve are given essentially exodus out of that into Yahweh's temple, into the land made good and fit for life. We have a fall after that, as a lot of exoduses sadly have, and we get Cain and Abel, where Cain becomes the seed of the serpent, the goat for Azazel, who is cast out into the wilderness, and he becomes fruitful and multiplies into his own nation that will ultimately end in judgment in the flood. But we also have Abel, who is associated with a sin offering and is the bearer of the promises of the seed of the woman, the coming Redeemer. Abel is killed. Seth takes on those promises instead as a replacement. So we keep going. Now we have Noah. He's in this ruined state of these violent, oppressive cities, and so he is given exodus out of this through the waters, using a lot of the same imagery and words as is used in the Exodus of Israel, which is the case with all of these exoduses. And he comes out the other side, and then again we have another two goats scenario where Ham becomes the goat for Azazel, the seed of the serpent. He wrongs the elect one. He wrongs Noah. He wrongs his family. And he goes on to become an empire builder. He becomes fruitful and multiplies into great wicked cities that will later become enemies of Israel. And then we have Shem, who he bears the promises of the seed of the woman. It's a really short story, so we don't have a lot of detail linking us to that motif, but as we examine later motifs and see this pattern building, it becomes very clear that that's part of the two goats motif. Then, so we're in Babel now. It's after the flood. We've had Ham's son Nimrod. He's built Babel. We're in this chaotic, ruinous city again, full of violence and oppression. And Abraham is given exodus out of this scenario. The inhabitants are scattered. Abraham lives in this world of exile, and he's given exodus to Canaan. Again, he falls. So he goes down to Egypt, like you said. And you even mentioned a second ago that this was part of the Exodus motif. He's oppressed in Egypt with Sarai, and they're given exodus back to Canaan. where, again, we have Abraham brought closer to Yahweh. Lot is sent out away from him. And I think we've touched on this being part of the two goats motif, but we haven't fully explained it because this picks up more in chapters 19, I think. So we'll talk about this more in a couple of weeks. But that's the latest installment of our two goats motif. But the story goes on where Sarai wrongs Hagar in using her as a surrogate slave. She flees like the Israelites flee. She goes through her own exodus. Like you mentioned, we see God's grace there as he shows this elect kindness, this exodus kindness to someone who is not exactly part of the elect family. And then we get hints that Ishmael is going to be at enmity with his brother. So we should be expecting another two goats motif to pop up soon. Now we're back to chapter 17 with the circumcision we just talked about, and we can move on. So
I'm impressed with, off the top of your head, coming up with a very good summary of where we've seen those motifs already in Genesis. And I'll say I've had the privilege of being able to read his book already, and it is phenomenal. And so when it comes out, I would highly encourage you to check it out. And I'm sure once it officially gets published, we'll let you know.
Yeah, we'll let you know on here. I'm just looking forward to getting the cover now.
Yeah, so. Very cool, very cool. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and close our time out today, and looking forward to talking to you next time.
Great.